This is an oral history interview for the Archives of Iowa Broadcasting. It's September 19th, 2023. I'm Cliff Brockman, along with producer Paul Yeager. Today, our guest is George Lindblade. He's a noted photographer and documentarian from Sioux City. Thanks for joining us this morning, George.
Well, it's good to be here. I'm sure we'll have some interesting things to talk about.
I think we will. You and I worked together briefly back in the 80s, and I know you've had some interesting stuff in your life.
Oh, yeah.
Let's start kind of at the beginning. You started out in still photography. How did you get interested in photography?
Well, as some people know, I had kind of an interesting birth, and I wasn't expected to live. And so after a couple of days of laying around the hospital, they decided to see if they could put me back together, and they did. But as a result of that, as I progressed into the school years and stuff, because I have what you would call an autopsy stitch on my stomach, they wouldn't allow me to participate in any sports or anything. They were always afraid I was going to break open. So little George was kind of the guy sitting on the sidelines all the time. So I decided, well, maybe there's some other thing I could do and become more popular in the world and society. And my mother liked to take pictures, and she had an old box camera, and I picked it up and I started taking pictures. And as it progressed, when I was 7 years old, I went to my first fire and took pictures, and everybody liked the fire pictures, and my career was made. So I knew if you have a camera and you show up at any event, you're the most popular guy there. And for the last 85 years, I've showed up at a lot of events with my camera, and I'm always the most popular guy there.
Well, George, then you went out to California for a while and did some photography out there. Yeah, what did you do out there?
Well, I went out to California, and I had family that lived out there, and I had an aunt and uncle that were in the construction business, and they always wanted me to come out there. And so eventually I did, and I bought a little photography studio in Cathedral City, California, which is right between Palm Springs and Rancho Mirage. And it was all right. We sold some cameras and film and processing and things like that. But then there was another guy from Iowa, a guy by the name of Jones, Milt Jones, who was a pharmacist. He graduated from the University of Iowa, and he had a shop across the street from mine. And there was a magazine out there in Palm Springs called The Villager. And Milt never wanted to be a pharmacist, but he was. And he said, I wish we could get a hold of that magazine. I think between the two of us we could do something. And lo and behold, we did. We bought the magazine, and it was kind of a society magazine, and one thing led to another, and the next thing we knew that Milt and I were in the middle of the social circuit out there. And of course, a lot of movie stars lived there, and fortunate for us, we became friends and acquaintances of them, and so our magazine was quite popular.
And then how long did you stay out there, George?
I was out there about 7 and 8 years, something like that. And in the meantime, I had a contract with NBC out of Los Angeles. So what events like Dwight Eisenhower was out there, and quite a few people, and some of their show people, Sinatra, of course, lived there, and Bob Hope. And my acquaintance with Bob Hope was kind of interesting, too, because I was at a party one night, not taking pictures, but and I was admiring. We were in a house in Palm Desert, and I was admiring the photography on the walls. And the lady who owned the house came over to me and said something about me liking the photography, and she said, "Well, one of my relatives took those," and I said, "Oh, is he a photographer here?" And she says, "Well, it's Cecil B. DeMille," and I said, "Oh, well, okay." And she said, "I understand you're from Sioux City, Iowa." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "There's another person here from that area." So we went into the other room, and she introduced me to this gal. And she said, "Oh, yeah, I've heard you're out here." And I said, "Yeah, well, I guess good news travel fast." And she says, "Have you ever met Bob Hope?" And I said, "No." And she says, "Well, I'm his script supervisor, and Bob's in the other room. Would you like to meet him?" So I said, sure, I'd like to meet him. So we go in there, and she introduces me, and he looks at me, and he says, do you know Elliot Woolridge? And I said, well, everybody in Sioux City knows Elliot Woolridge. I said, he's a prominent insurance man. He says, I stayed at his house in 1952 when the polio epidemic hit Sioux City, and I was there to entertain. And so the discussion was around Elliot Woolridge and his trials and tribulations. And so then he said to me, you take pictures? And I said, yeah. And he said, have you ever taken any for me? And I said, no. And he says, well, we'll change that. He says, we're going to have you take some pictures. And that's how it all started right there. And the gal was actually from South Sioux City, Nebraska, but the bridge didn't make any difference at that time. So I started taking a lot of pictures of Bob Hope. I did the Bob Hope Desert Classic for several years. I was on the board of directors of the Classic. I did a lot of work for Chrysler Corporation, and it circulated around Bob Hope. But in the meantime, it's when I ran into Frank Sinatra quite unexpectedly at Canyon Country Club. And Frank and I became close friends. I'd go to his house, he'd come to my house, and we always had an agreement that I would never publish anything that I knew or took a picture of without first getting his permission. And that just led into more photography with other stars and the stars' weddings and things like that. Because as Frank would always say, George is very discreet. And so being discreet and having him in your hip pocket was quite an asset for me. And we pretty much stayed in touch until his passing. But and then the Marx Brothers, everybody, my age or probably your age, knew the Marx Brothers, and Harpo and Zeppo and Chico, and they were a great family too. Harpo, his wife was on the school board, and she used to call me up all the time and say, George, you're from Sioux City, Iowa. Where is Sioux City? And I'd tell her. She says, well, our daughter's going to Cal Poly, and she wants to get into agriculture, and we don't know anything about agriculture. Can you come over to our house? And I said, well, Susan, I didn't grow up on a farm. I said, she said, I thought everybody in Iowa was on a farm. I said, no, not really. But I spent many, many nights at the Rancho Harpo talking about farming that I knew nothing about. But I also had a friend of mine that was in the movie business who was a stuntman and a wrangler, and he knew quite a bit about farming. So I'd bring him with me, and we could sit there and talk. And Harpo did talk a lot. He loved to talk, and he loved to help people, and he was a very, very nice guy.
Well, George, you were having quite the life out there, but you came back to Sioux City. Why did you come back to Sioux City?
Well, that life is not conducive to being married. So with the first wife and I, we parted way because she was originally from Elk Point, South Dakota, and she moved out there with me, and she couldn't adapt to the lifestyle. And when you run in that circuit, it's not that you're partying or anything else, because as I've told people in the past, I said, you can't be part of the party. You are a recorder of the party. So you cannot be doing anything very boisterous. The more you're in the shadows, the more successful you be. But still you're gone. You're gone for days at times, and you can't explain a lot of the stuff where you're at. And it's not a good family life. And I tell young people that are getting into business, if you seriously want to get in business, don't get married, because your life is that camera, and you have to be able to move and go and do when the whistle blows. You got to be ready to go, and that is not conducive to a good family style.
Well, you told me that you got into TV news by accident.
Well, yeah, it was kind of accident. That was KTIV when they went on the air here. I was chasing the fire truck here, and somebody said, why don't you take that picture up to KTIV? I bet they'd run it. They'd been on the air for 3 or 4 months. And so Ken Wayman was the news director, and I went up there and said, here's some pictures of a fire that was out on Kansas Street, and the fire truck had a wreck out there. And so Oh yeah. And then one thing led to another, and then for a brief time there, in my younger age, I helped out on the city ambulance, and so and I was kind of stringing for the local TV station there. So I used to carry a Polaroid 95A in the ambulance, and I'd jump out, grab a few pictures of the ambulance, and we'd have them on TV that night. And finally, one night I went in the hospital, and one of the doctors said, "You're the guy that takes the pictures at the wrecks." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Why don't you bring them up here first?" And I said, "Well, they're usually in the ambulance. I don't get them to the TV station till we go back." And he said, "No," he says, "they help." He says, he says, "Well, I can see the dynamics of the injury, the damage to the car." He says, "It helps with the diagnosis." He says, "I know what to look for." He said, "They'd help us out if you bring them." So I started doing that. But it's kind of interesting how this web we weave in this business. So one thing led to another, and I wound up working at KTIV, and that's where there was another fellow working in the other room as a booth announcer, we called it. You never did see him on television, but his name was Tom Brokaw. And he was going to the University of South Dakota, and the story is told in the fellow by the name of Don Stone, he was quite a celebrity in his own right. He would always fill in summers for Don McNeil's Breakfast Club out of Chicago. And Don was the program manager of the station, and somewhat arrogant. And we were, Brokaw and Don and I were standing out in the front one night watching the Huntley-Brinkley report. And Brokaw says to me, "Boy," he says, "I'd sure like to do that sometime." And I said, "Do what?" And he says, "I'd like to be on the national news." At which time Mr. Stone stood up, turned around, looked at Tom, and says, "Well, Tom, maybe you don't belong in broadcasting." And Tom says, "Well, why not?" And he says, "Well, you have a speech impediment." He kind of slapped the counter that we were leaning on and walked away. Brokaw turned around, looked at me, and he said, "Do I have a speech impediment?" I said, "Well, you talk funny, but that's because you're from South Dakota." But I said, "I think you're all right." He says, "God, maybe I don't belong in broadcasting," and kind of walked off back to his booth area but history took its course, and you can see where Tom wound up. And we laugh about it. And as I was working in California, and Tom is not the only success story that I had a hand in, and I don't know that I had a hand in his, but I just told him, "Yeah, you're all right. You are from South Dakota." But every time anybody get together that worked at the old KTIV or heard the story, they and Tom would laugh together. And but the story that always, as things would happen after I moved back to Sioux City, and I went to work at KCAU for a fellow by the name of Bill Turner. Bill Turner, everybody in broadcasting knows that name because he was one of a kind. He knew I was back here, and he got a hold of me, and he said, "Come on down and talk to me." So I went down and talked to him. He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I don't know." He said, did know what I was going to do. I was going to go to WBAL in Baltimore. I had an offer of quite a wonderful job there, but he said, "I want to start a department here that we can make a name for ourselves, that KCAU can make a name for itself." And but he said, "I want you to head it up." And I said, "I don't know." I said, "It would take a lot of money to do that." He says, "Well, I've got a lot of money." And he says, "Well, whatever it takes." So I put together a group, and we started a company essentially called Creative Services. And we housed ourselves at ABC affiliate here in Sioux City, but we did primarily work for ABC Network. And that took us all over the world too. But while we were based in Sioux City, we had a young fellow by the name of Ron Clemens, who was going to Heelan High School, just up the street from the TV station, and was from a single-parent household, and very poor, very introverted. And he came in one night to me, and he said, "Can I buy a roll of film?" And I said, "No, Ron, you can't buy a roll of film. What do you want a roll of film for?" And he says, "Well, I'm working on a project." And I said, "Okay, I'll give you a roll of film, but you can't buy it." I said, "Okay." So I gave him the roll of film. And he disappeared. And he, like I said, he was very introverted. He wouldn't look at you in the eye. He'd look at the ground when he talked to you. And so he disappeared. And 2 or 3 days later, I ran into him in the hall, and I said, "Ron, you don't have a camera. What are you going to do with the film?" He says, "Well, I was going to ask if I could borrow a camera." I said, "If you tell me what you're doing," because I said, "There's all kinds of cameras." And he says, "Well, I'm working on a cartoon." And I said, "Well, you need a single frame camera, a Bolex camera." And he said, "Do we have one here?" And I said, "Yeah." So a fellow that was my engineer and chief technician, Dave Gross, I said, "Will you fix Ron up with a coffee stand and whatever he needs?" And we went in one of the old offices down there. It was old Gene Sherman's old office. A lot of broadcasters know Gene's name. And so they fixed him up with a coffee stand. And about a month later, he came in with a roll of film that he had shot. And he said, "Could you process it?" And I said, "Sure." So we put it in the run. And Dean Maytag, who was went to WTMJ, he was general manager of WTMJ after he left Sioux City. And then he went to one of the universities and headed up their journalism department. But anyway, he processed it. And he came in to me and he says, "Did you see what he did?" And I said, "Well, no, you processed it." And he said, "Well, you better look at it." I said, "Oh, God, tell me it wasn't a porn." And he says, "No, it's not a porn, but look at it." So I looked at it, and I went, "Oh my God, this is great." And I said, "Get a hold of Ron, I want him to see it." So Ron came in, looked at it very quietly, said, "Can I get a couple more rolls of film?" I said, "You can get all the film you want." I said, "Ron, what are you going to do when you graduate?" He says, "I don't know, I want to go to school." I said, "Where do you want to go to school?" He said, "I want to learn more about animation." "Where'd you go to school?" I said, "Art Center College in Los Angeles." And he said, "I'd like to go there." And I said, "Well, that'd be nice." But knowing what it costs to go to Art Center, I went up and talked to Bill Turner at the time, and I told him what Ron had done. He says, "Where do you want to go to school?" I said, "Art Center." And he says, "I'll pay for it." I said, "Bill," I said, "he can be a neurosurgeon for what it'll cost for him to go." He says, "I want him to go there." And I said, "Okay." So he said, "Tell him I'm paying the tuition, he can go." But he says, "You got to find him a job out there." And I said, "Bill, I've been gone for almost 2 years." I said, "I don't know if I can find him a job." But he says, "Find him a job." Okay. So I went down and I talked to the guy that was his immediate supervisor and told him what the situation was. And this is where the story really gets different. He says, "Well, let's call some of these places out there." I said, "Well, don't call Disney, because they're not nice people and they're hard to get along with, because I've dealt with them before." And he says, "Well, no." He says, let's call Hanna-Barbera." And he had a directory there of production companies. And he said, "It's always better if you ask for somebody by name." So he come up with this name, and the guy had a very unusual first name. His last name was Johnson. So we didn't have a speakerphone, so Bill calls the guy and puts his hand over the thing, and he says, he's coming to the phone. He says, "Now what the hell are you going to say?" I said, "You just pulled his name out of the air." He says, "I'll think of something." And so the guy comes to the phone, and there's this kind of strange laugh, and yeah, that street's still here. Yeah. He puts his hand on the phone. He says, "The guy's from Sioux City." I said, "Oh, God." So anyway, he tells him the story of Ron, and he says, "Yeah, I'll give him a job." And he says, Bill said to Mr. Johnson, he says, "Are you in the animation department there?" He says, "Yeah, I am an animator." He says, "I do Bullwinkle." And he said, "We need an inker, and we'll start him out as an inker on the cells." So Ron went out and went to work for him. He was out there about 3 months, and in the fall of the year, the movie industry always has a layoff because of all the holidays, and he got laid off, and he came back to Sioux City apparently. And I got a phone, it was on a Friday afternoon, from Walt Disney Studios. They wanted to talk to Ron. I said, "No, Ron's in California." They said, "No, he's not. He's on his way back to Sioux City." Very arrogant. And I said, "Well," I said, he hasn't checked in with me, but I said, "I'll have him call you." And so I called his mother, and she said, "Yeah, he's on his way back. He's driving back." So I said, have him call me. So he called, and I told him it was Disney Studios. And Ron got very nervous, and he said, I said, what are they looking for you for? And he says, well, when I left, he says, I left that video. We'd made a videotape of the cartoon he did in Sioux City. He says, I left it with them with my resume. So I said, well, call them and see what they want. So he did. He calls me back. He says, they want me back out there Monday for an interview. And I said, well, Ron, I said, he says, I can't drive out there that quick. I said, have them send you a plane ticket. He says, will they do that? And I said, sure, they'll do that. So he called them back, and they did. And they interviewed him on Monday. Made him an offer on Tuesday, and Wednesday he went to work for him as an animator. And he'd go from an unknown to an animator at Walt Disney Studios is like walking on the moon. It don't happen. But they gave him a staff, a guy by the name of John Musker. And he and John teamed up, and they did The Black Cauldron, they did The Little Mermaid, they did Aladdin, they did about 6 movies. And today, Ron is known as the guy that saved Walt Disney Studios from bankruptcy. And he was just back here, and we got together, and I presented him with the camera that he made his first cartoon with at a symphony orchestra event. And he says, well, you know, he says, I'm retiring now. And I said, you get a good retirement? And he says, yeah. He says, I do. He says, I get $1.5 million a year for the rest of my life, and my wife gets half of it after I die. And I get 10% of all the proceeds of Walt Disney Studios. And I said,
That's a great story.
Yeah, it's a great story. I've met John Musker, his partner, who is one of the most cantankerous people you'll ever speak to in your life. He grew up the same way that Ron did, no money, no nothing. He retired about 2 years ago, and Ron was here 2 years ago for one of the shows, and they premiered it here at the Orpheum and Theater. And he, everybody wanted, we all went back and signed the wall behind the stage, and everybody wanted Ron to draw a cartoon. Well, he was still actively working for Disney, and he says, I can't. He says, my contract won't allow me to do it. And Ron says, give me that damn pen. I can draw anything he can. He said, what do you want? And stood back there and drew all kinds of cartoons. He says, I'm retired. They can't fire me. So, yeah, and so, you know, it was that type of a thing. But he's probably my proudest moment. And then John Pavlovich, who was another kid that worked with us in creative services because everybody thought he was nuts. Well, he went on to win I don't know how many Emmys. He was the principal cameraman for CBS. He's the guy that did the opening every year of the Olympics. He did the Super Bowl. He's been written up in Sports Illustrated and all the rest of it. And it's been 2 years ago. He was riding his bike. He lived in near San Francisco, and he was riding his bike, and a gal bumped him with her car, and it really didn't hurt him, but his leg didn't get any better. And the following morning, his wife took him to outpatient. While they were filling out the information, John dropped dead. And it was due to an aneurysm, had nothing to do with the accident. But here's a guy that was in incredible physical shape, was an expert skier, played football, did all the good things you're supposed to do, and still he died quite young. But there was a time they called it the golden age of KCAU, and in that period of time, 5 of the people that worked with us. One is vice president of Warner Brothers. One is one of the big writers, feature writers for NBC. They all really went on to great things, and I give the credit to Bill Turner, because Bill Turner said about every employee after we started this. He said, I don't want any lifers. He says, I want people to work here that want to go on with their careers and their futures. And he says, whatever they want to do, we'll finance it and make sure they get where they want to be. And we did.
George, let me interrupt here. I'd like to get back to you and some of the things that you did in Sioux City. You worked in news.
I did. I worked in news, and but
you covered some big stories. One of them I wanted to talk about was the Wounded Knee incident. Can you tell us that was where some?
Oh, sure. Yeah, the Wounded Knee thing. That came up just really quick when the occupation took the turn for the worse, and the U.S. Marshal Service was called in, and it was just the place was under siege out there. And so Russell Means and I had done stories together, and he was the AIM leader out there. And I knew if anybody could get next to Russell, I could. So we took 3 or 4 out of the other people and myself and chartered a plane, flew out there, got out to the Wounded Knee area, and the feds had locked it all down and weren't going to let media in or anybody else. There was a CBS crew in there. They'd got in and they were just bivouacked in there. They set up camp in there. So, and we had a couple of cases of film with us, 16 millimeter film. And so as we're jawing with the federal agents, they're telling us they're not letting any more news media in there. And a guy came out of the crowd, an agent, and he looked at me and he said, "George, what are you doing here?" And it was a guy I'd worked with out in L.A. And I said, "Oh, we want to get in there and get some stuff." I said, "You know the routine." He says, "Yeah." And he told the other agents, he said, "Let these guys through." He says, "All right, I know all of them." So we got in part of the way, and we were stopped again by an AIM group. And they were going to turn us back because they said the media had been nasty to them. And Russell Means came to our rescue there, and he says, "No, let them in." He says, "They're right." He says, "They'll tell our story." So we got in there, and we were in there for a couple of days getting shot at like everybody else. But that was one of the better stories. It was a great story. I wish we could have spent more time out there, but it was settled afterwards. But of course, you remember that wound up with some federal agents getting shot. And even today, there's repercussions around here. If you talk to the wrong person about what happened out there, everybody has an opinion. That was a good story. The flood that hit Rapid City. I was in the newsroom early on a Saturday morning, and I seen where they knew at that time that at least 100 people had died. It wound up to be 235. And again, I chartered a plane, grabbed some guys and some film, and away we went. And we were out there. We came back, put together a show, a telethon, and raised several $1,000s to send out there for the rehabilitation. In those days, news stations and TV stations and radio stations and everything, we tried to work in the common good. We tried to give back to the communities, and of course, with KCAU, the CAU stood for Cares About You, and we did. I mean, that was the hallmark of the station. If somebody needed help, if somebody needed something done, get out there and get it done, and let it be. But we don't have that anymore. That part of the broadcast business is long gone. It's more of a bottom line thing. But I've been in prison riots. I was in Joliet in the prison riot. I was in the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. I've been shot at. I've been crapped on. I've been whatever. But and I wouldn't trade it. I wouldn't trade it. I've been in the hills of the Amazon forest. I've been down there with the natives and the mineros, the miners that mine diamonds and alluvial mining in the rivers down there. I've been to Barrow, Alaska, to the North Pole, and shot at the dew line out there with the radar. And there isn't too many places I haven't been. I've been in China. I've been in Hong Kong. I've been in Japan, most of Europe. Photography's been good to me. Everybody says, "God, you ought to be a millionaire and retired." I said, no, it wasn't about the money. it was about, doing the things and being there, and if we can help out, we do.
George, you told me about a couple of fun stories you did. One was about a guy who had hiccups. What was that about?
Yep. Yeah, there was a guy down here in a little town in Iowa, and he had hiccups for 65 years. And there used to be a ABC show called Real People, and they wanted to do him. They wanted to do a story about him. So we went down there and spent a week with him. And he did. He hiccuped day and night. And we asked him, what brought on the hiccups? He says, well, went out to kill a pig, and he says, I was going to pull it up in the tree to dress it out, and he says, as I was pulling it up, he says, I got a hiccup from pulling on the rope, and they never went away. So he said, after I don't know how many years of doctoring here, somebody called in some specialist from the East Coast, and he came out and worked with him, and then he went back, and then when Real People was the name of the show, put all this together, we brought that doctor back out here, and Charlie Osborne, that was his name, and Charlie had all of his food he had to put in blenders and make soup out of it, and no matter what it was. But Charlie lived 6 or 8 years. He was in his mid-80s, I think, when he finally passed away. But he hiccuped till the day he died, and it was an incredible story, and right under our nose.
And you told me about another story you did for the Playboy channel.
Oh, the Playboy channel, yes. These young boys and girls are practicing birth control. That's how they headlined it. Jeff Pill, who headed up Playboy Television, was originally from Sioux City. And he always wanted me to do a show for Playboy. And I said, God, I don't know if there's anything in Sioux City, Iowa that would appeal to Playboy. And so I did this thing on detasseling corn. And detasseling corn is essentially birth control for corn. And that's when the kids would go out at 5 o'clock in the morning, and coincidentally the Trojan seed company sponsored this particular event that we were on. Of course, there's a Trojan prophylactic out there too, so they put the two things together. And we went out and spent a day in the field with these young boys and girls, and put the raw film together, sent it out there, and they sent us back what they were going to run. And sure as heck, it came out as these young boys and girls from Sioux City, Iowa were practicing a form of birth control. And believe it or not, we didn't catch a lot of flack over it. I figured we would, because we ran it locally. And the one story we did catch some flack for is, at one point in history, they decided that they were going to pull up all the ditchweed marijuana that was around here. And so that sounded like a good story. So they got all the Boy Scouts together, and the clergyman and the police chief, and gathered them all together downtown and showed them what marijuana looked like. And they got dump trucks, and they went out and they pulled up marijuana all day. And then they took it out to the local dump and they burned it. And then the parents started ringing the phone at the TV station. Well, you've successfully shown our children how to harvest marijuana. How are you going to, take care of the sins you've committed? And now we listened to that for about a week. And then the other story that we really caught flack over, the University of Iowa put out a report one time about how small towns in Iowa were dying. And so two of us went up to Remsen, Iowa, and the sign on as you go into Remsen, Iowa today reads, "Neat and hard to beat." That's the story of Remsen, Iowa. Well, Remsen, Iowa at the time had a bar on about every corner. But we went up there and showed some empty businesses and empty streets and stuff, and said our on-camera guy, Ron Gonder, who went to KCRG afterwards, because we both quit over this, This is back to KTIV days. He read off that epitaph that neat and hard to beat is Remsen, Iowa, but not so according to a report from the University of Iowa. And then they talked about how the small towns were going downhill. We ran that at 6 o'clock at night, that story. By 8:30, the station, which was at 221 10th Street, was full of people from Remsen, Iowa. And it was like right out of the old witch hunts. All they lacked was the pitchforks and the burning torches. And they really raised hell with us. And so we went up the next day and did a recapitulation and said, but Remsen, Iowa is different. They're growing and they're progressing and all the rest of it. And then Ron and I both quit. He went to KCRG and I went to California. That was actually the pivot point. As I look back over, I said, they're not going to back us up. We're not going to, why be here,
Well, George, somewhere in there you started your own creative services. You had creative services at KCAU, but then you started GRL.
Yep.
And you have done a lot of production and training work. One of them was with the, with the United 232 crash.
Yes, our studio at that time, or our offices, were on Jones Street, and the convention center was also on Jones Street. That's where the NTSB set up their headquarters. That incident, the first phone call I got was shortly before it crashed. It was from the City Hall. And I don't know why they called me, but they said, can you land a DC-10 at the Sioux City Airport? And I said, yeah, you can land it there, but I said, there's some doubt if you could take off, depending on what the weight was on it. I said, why? And they said, well, there's a DC-10 headed for Sioux City. It's lost an engine. And I said, lost? I said, fell off the plane or just quit running? They said, we don't know. And I said, well, if it just quit running, no problem, they can land it. I said, if the engine actually fell off, might have a problem. And then the rest is history, They crashed and burned, and we never did go to the site. We did afterwards, but suddenly we became the headquarters because the investigators and the people coming in and the fire department and everybody else needed a place to start gathering the data and the information and the photography and all the rest of it. Well, our studio became that focal point. And most of as the NTSB and the engineers came in, they didn't want to be where the media would have access to them. Our place was quite private, and so they could set up there. And we did a lot of the engineering, film and still pictures for NTSB and for United and for McDonnell Douglas, and we became invested in it up to our neck. And then we even followed through and set up all the video and recording of all the NTSB hearings. So we got thrown over to the other side of the thing, more into the investigation and in the dark shadows of the thing again. Then we produced a film called Alert 3 about how it was how Sioux City responded to it, and how all the various organizations came together for it. And conservatively, there's 100,000 copies of that show around the world, and it's done in 5 languages. And it just outlined it. It's called the Sioux City Project, and the FAA today say it was the most successful handling of a crash there was, as far as getting the injured to the hospital. Everybody that was hurt was in the hospital within 41 minutes. All the victims, the deceased, were out of sight and into a temporary morgue within 2 hours. And this just doesn't happen, especially in a town the size of Sioux City. I got to know Al Haynes quite well, and I flew on his last flight out of his retirement. But that was an experience that no one ever wants to go through. But if you have to, and Embry-Riddle University that trains lots of control tower people and aviators and such as that, that's one of their courses, and it's based on the film. Now, when they did the movie, 1,000 Heroes, it was based on that film of Alert 3 because they premiered it here, and Charlton Heston played Al Haynes. And the guy that wrote the movie version of it said it was, he said, I'll be up front with you. He said, if you had not done that Alert 3, this movie would have never been made. Because he said, we used it for the pattern, and that's how they did it.
Well, great. Well, in the time we have left, George, I wanted to jump to something you've written an autobiography. On the dust cover on the back of your autobiography, you've got some advice for photographers. Tell us about that.
Well, I don't know what it is offhand. I haven't looked at that book in years, but I tell all of them, be aware of your circumstances, and you are not the story. You are recording the story, and don't insert yourself into it. I think that's the most important thing I can tell people. Because young people all want to be a celebrity photographer. Well, being a celebrity photographer is not something you do on your own. You gain that celebrity, and you do that by treating people well. And I also tell newsmen, and this is a thing that's very disturbing now. Very few people have a journalism degree. Not that I had a journalism degree, but I worked with a lot of people that had many journalism degrees. And I think we lack that today. But you have to have an integrity. You have to have that. I'm the bug on the wall. I'm not in the middle of it. And everybody seems to watch the paparazzi on TV and such, and they think there's some celebrity like that. And like they always say with Sinatra, how did you have access? I said, well, were you a paparazzi? I said, no. God, no. I said, I was usually in the car either with him or with his bodyguard or with his press agent. I said, we never were in that lineup out in front, and we'd always go in the back doors if we could, Sinatra included. And we stayed away. Sammy Davis Jr. Was one hell of a photographer. He was good. And Sammy and I would sit and talk about photography when people thought we were out carousing with the gentry. We weren't. He and I'd be sitting on a crate of eggs in the kitchen talking about the latest camera that came out. Red Skelton. I'm digressing from what you asked, but with Red Skelton, he was the same way. Now, Red Skelton, and I've had it happen. You'd be out in the yard out there in California doing something, and Red would drive by and get out and help you. I mean, he was just that kind of guy. All right, I'd get a call from somebody in L.A. that wanted to come down and do something about Palm Springs and say, are there any celebrities down there? Well, in the summer, there wouldn't be. It's not that way now. They're there all year round. I'd say, I can get you somebody. Well, who can you get us? I can get Red Skelton. Well, are you sure? And I said, yeah, he was really hot at the time. I said, yeah. I said, I can call him. What do you want him to do? And I'd call him up and say, Red, I got somebody coming in from the LA Times. They want a celebrity. Do you know any celebrities? That'd be his comeback. I'd say, well, no, but I thought I'd call you instead. He said, well, okay, I'll do it. Yeah. He said, what car do you want me to bring? I said, I don't care. He said, well, he had 7 Rolls Royces, one for each day of the week. And so I'd say, well, bring the blue one or bring the red one. Okay, I'll do that. And he'd do it and be happy to do it. I mean, he was a super guy. And another sidebar with him, one of his close friends out there was a guy named Stan Elkins. Stan was from Harlan, Iowa. He owned a hardware store, H&H Hardware. And Red would go in and do his show on Tuesday night, his TV show, and Wednesday morning he'd be down at H&H Hardware. And he'd be in there, and you thought he was either working there or buying something there, because he'd talk to all the people, the customers and things like that. And every once in a while we'd have to take pictures of the folks back in Iowa for Red with Stan, because people in Harlan didn't believe Red Skelton would be in San Elkins hardware store. But yeah, I wouldn't trade anything I did, never. I've met some people, including my wife of 38 years here, and I only say if I'd met her out there, I'd still be there.
George, I've got one last question for you.
Okay.
How would you like to be remembered?
Well, I think I am remembered by the people that I've put in the business, or I didn't put them in the business, but I've given them some direction, and they're doing it. Tim Turner, Bill Turner's son, he was headed for medical school, and lo and behold, he worked a summer with me, and medical school went away, and his mother wouldn't speak to me for 2 years, but he's in New York doing what I do. The Ron Clements and a few of these other guys, Marty Eicher, who's vice president of Warner Brothers, John Baring, which we didn't talk about. John Baring currently directs Blue Bloods, and he does Law and Order, and I don't know how many shows. And he started a thing on the West Coast called Lindblade University, and there's sweatshirts and T-shirts and stuff with the logo on it. He designed a logo, and he says all of us learned more from you than we ever did in any other form of education. He said he said you showed us how, when your back is against the wall, to come out successfully. And he said a lot of the things you'll see on Blue Bloods, he says, I learned at Channel 9 when I worked with you. He says every show has a budget. And he says, sometimes, he says, we get awful close to going over that budget. And he says, I always revert back to, how would George done that at Channel 9? And he says, we usually come in ahead, where we're supposed to be. So he said, I just thought it was proper that we have Lindblade University, because he said, we all learned a lot from it. I guess that would be the legacy.
George, I really appreciate your time here this morning. You've had an extremely interesting and varied career.
I can tell you another little thing, maybe you won't want to use it, but Bill Turner used to be the producer for the Iowa Boys basketball. And this is one of the funniest things that's ever happened to me, or will ever happen to any cameraman. Frosty Mitchell, who was a Des Moines celebrity, and he was always the on-camera guy down there for the boys basketball, was interviewing Governor Bob Ray, who was an old broadcaster too. And I'm using a handhold TK-47 that weighed about 50 pounds. And we're out there in the center. And one of the guys Bob Wilson was a sports announcer from Sioux City. He was also the PA announcer at Des Moines. And so we're interviewing live the governor. He's paging, jack me off, call the announcer stand. Jack me off, call the announcers. The oldest roost there is to a PA announcer. I start to laugh, the camera starts to shake. Bob Ray is looking out of his corner of his eye at me, and the tears are running down his face. We all, as the broadcast huddle out there in the center thing, somebody actually fell for that line. And we broadcasted it all over the state of Iowa. But other than that, yeah, it's been a great life. And I'm still doing it. So
I think that might be a good place to leave it, George.
It is. And stay in touch, because there's always another chapter.
Well, thank you so much for your time, George.
Thank you.
You bet. I'm Cliff Brockman with Paul Yeager. This has been an interview for the Archives of Iowa Broadcasting, our oral history project.